Sometimes the pain we ignore becomes the thing that changes everything. For 34-year-old ranch hand Caleb Brody, what started as a simple footache would soon reveal a horror beyond imagination. He'd been working the borderlands near Marrow Creek, pushing through rough country that locals avoided. The pain in his boot kept getting worse, along with a fever that made him dizzy. When he finally limped into Doc Harrison's clinic that September evening, he expected to hear about a bad blister. Instead, the old doctor's face went white as chalk. Inside Caleb's festering wound, rows of pale larvae moved beneath the skin, pulsing like they had a life of their own. The sight left even the experienced physician shaking. What had Caleb stepped into out there in the wasteland? What kind of curse was now eating him alive from the inside out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. The leather-bound journal sat heavy in Doc Harrison's weathered hands, its pages yellowed with decades of careful entries. Each case meticulously documented, each mystery dutifully recorded, and far too many left unsolved. The old physician had been tending to the people of Marrow Creek for 37 years, and in all that time, he'd never seen anything quite like what writhed beneath Caleb Brody's skin. Caleb sat on the examination table, his boot and sock discarded on the floor, the smell of infection thick in the small clinic. The wound on his foot gaped open like a mouth, revealing the pale, segmented creatures that moved with deliberate purpose beneath the inflamed tissue. Each time one shifted, Caleb winced, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles went white. "How long you been working the borderlands, son?" Doc Harrison asked, pulling his spectacles down to get a better look at the journal's earlier entries. His fingers traced over pages filled with similar cases, unexplained ailments, strange symptoms, people who'd ventured too far into the forbidden territories beyond the creek. "Been writing those parts for near on 15 years, Caleb replied, his voice strained with pain and fatigue. "Started when I was just 19, fresh off my daddy's spread in Colorado. Figured the work down here would be easier, fewer questions asked. Better pay for a man willing to chase strays through rough country." Doc Harrison nodded thoughtfully. He remembered when Caleb first arrived in Marrow Creek, a young man with calloused hands and honest eyes, the kind who didn't shy away from hard work or dangerous ground. Over the years, he'd watched Caleb mature into one of the most reliable ranch hands in the territory, a man who could track cattle through the most unforgiving landscape and bring them home safe. "You been working the Blackwater Canyon area lately?" The doctor's question came quietly, almost reluctantly. Caleb's head snapped up, his fever-bright eyes focusing sharply on the older man. "How do you know about that?" "Because I've been keeping records longer than you've been breathing. In every case like yours, every strange sickness, every unexplained disappearance, they all tie back to that stretch of land." Doc Harrison set the journal down and reached for his medical bag. "Question is, what were you doing out there? Most folks with any sense give that canyon a wide berth." The truth was, Caleb had been chasing a small herd of prime cattle that had broken through a fence during a storm 3 weeks prior. The animals had scattered into the wilderness, and with beef prices high and his employer's patience thin, he'd pushed deeper into the forbidden territory than any sensible man would go. The canyon was a maze of red rock walls and hidden springs. Perfect grazing land that should have been crawling with ranchers. Instead, it stood empty, avoided by locals who crossed themselves when its name came up in conversation. "Mr. Peterson lost 20 head in that storm," Caleb explained, watching, as Doc Harrison prepared a syringe. "Good stock, worth more than I make in 6 months. Couldn't just let them wander off to die or get taken by rustlers." "And did you find them?" Caleb's expression darkened. "Found most of them, but not where they should have been. They were clustered around this old stone marker, like they were protecting it or something. Strangest thing I ever saw, cattle don't act that way. Not unless something's got them spooked. Doc Harrison paused in his preparations. Stone marker? Yeah. Big thing, carved with symbols I couldn't make heads or tails of. Been there a long time. Looked like. The cattle wouldn't move away from it, and when I tried to drive them off, they got real agitated. That's when I noticed my foot starting to hurt. The doctor made a note in his journal, his handwriting careful and precise. In 30 years of practicing medicine in this remote corner of the territory, he'd learned to pay attention to details that other physicians might dismiss. The people of Marrow Creek lived close to the land, and the land held memories, some of them dark, some of them dangerous. I'm going to give you something for the pain, Doc Harrison said, filling the syringe with a clear fluid. But I want you to understand something, Caleb. This isn't just a medical problem. Those creatures in your foot, they're not like anything in my textbooks. Before Caleb could respond, the clinic door chimed, and Sheriff Martinez stepped inside. The lawman was in his mid-50s, his dark hair streaked with silver, and his face weathered by years of keeping the peace in a frontier town. He'd been expecting this visit. Word traveled fast in Marrow Creek, and news of Caleb's condition had already reached his ears. Doc, the sheriff nodded to the physician, then turned to Caleb. Heard you might have run into some trouble out in the canyon. Caleb looked between the two older men, sensing an undercurrent of knowledge that excluded him. Seems like everyone knows more about what's happening to me than I do. Sheriff Martinez pulled off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair, a gesture Caleb recognized as nervous habit. That's because we've seen this before, son. Not often, but enough times to know it's serious. What exactly have you seen? Doc Harrison and the sheriff exchanged a look that spoke of shared secrets and old fears. Finally, the doctor opened his journal to a page near the front, its edges more yellowed than the rest. 1962. He read aloud. Miguel Santos, age 28. Ranch hand. Found wandering the desert with a fever and lesions on his legs. Disappeared 3 days later. 1971. Sarah Whitman, age 34, schoolteacher. Went missing after a camping trip near the canyon. Her horse came back without her. 1985. James Cooper, 41, prospector. Last seen heading into Blackwater Canyon with his burro and supplies for a week. The list went on, each entry a life touched by the same mysterious force that now coursed through Caleb's veins. Some had disappeared, others had died of mysterious ailments, and a few had simply left town in the dead of night, never to be seen. Again, what ties them all together? Caleb asked, though part of him already knew the answer. They all spent time in the Forbidden Lands, Sheriff Martinez said. All of them crossed into territory that's been off-limits for generations. Off-limits by whose authority? The sheriff's jaw tightened. By the authority of common sense and respect for the dead. Before anyone could elaborate, the clinic door opened again, bringing with it the scent of sage and the soft jingle of silver jewelry. Elena Vasquez entered, her long dark hair braided with red thread, her dress a mix of traditional Mexican patterns and practical frontier wear. She owned and operated the Copper Bell Saloon, but her real value to the community lay in her knowledge of local history and folklore, knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that some things couldn't be explained by science alone. Caleb, she said, her voice carrying both warmth and concern. I heard about your trouble. Elena had always been kind to him, serving him meals when he was in town and listening to his stories of life on the range. She was about his age, with intelligent dark eyes and a quick smile. But there was something else about her, a depth of understanding that suggested she knew secrets most people never suspected. Elena, what do you know about the Blackwater Canyon? Doc Harrison asked directly. She looked at Caleb's exposed foot, studying the larvae with the calm assessment of someone who had seen such things before. I know that my grandmother warned me never to go there alone. She said the land remembers, and some memories are too painful to bear. Remembers what? The death of Joseph Crowfeather, Elena said simply. A healer who was murdered there in 1887. My grandmother told me the story when I was young, how he was killed while performing a protection ritual, how his blood soaked into the earth and his spirit never found rest. The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of the wall clock and Caleb's labored breathing. The larvae in his foot seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, as if responding to Elena's words. Your grandmother, Sheriff Martinez said. Carefully. She was there that night? Elena nodded. Maria Santos was Joseph's apprentice. She escaped when the others came, but she saw what happened. She saw the ritual he was performing when they killed him. What kind of ritual? A protection. Spell. Something to guard the sacred ground from those who would defile it. Elena's eyes met Caleb's. The question is, what kind of protection, and what does it want with you? Doc Harrison closed his journal and reached for his medical bag again. Whatever it is, we need to understand it quickly. These things inside you, they're growing. Caleb looked down at his foot, where the pale creatures had indeed become more active, their movements more pronounced. He could feel them beneath his skin in other places now, a crawling sensation along his leg, a strange tingling in his hands. How much time do I have? I don't know, the doctor admitted. But based on the other cases, not long. We need to find out what happened to Joseph Crowfeather, and we need to understand what he was trying to protect. Elena stepped closer, her hand hovering over Caleb's foot without quite touching it. There are others in town who might remember. Old families whose grandparents lived through those times. If we're going to help Caleb, we need to hear their stories. Sheriff Martinez settled his hat back on his head. I'll start asking questions, quietly. Some folks don't like talking about the old days, especially when it concerns the canyon. Why not? Caleb asked. The three looked at each other again, that same exchange of knowledge and concern. Because, Elena said softly, some of their families were there that night. Some of their ancestors helped kill Joseph Crowfeather. As if summoned by her words, the wind outside picked up, rattling the clinic windows and sending dust devils dancing down the main street of Marrow Creek. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, or perhaps it was something else entirely. Something that remembered the taste of blood and the feel of betrayal. Caleb closed his eyes, feeling the fever burn through his veins and the strange creatures shifting beneath his skin. Whatever had begun in Blackwater Canyon was far from over, and he was beginning to understand that his pain was just the first symptom of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple infection. The curse of Joseph Crowfeather was awakening, and Caleb Brody was its chosen vessel. The weathered land deed felt like ancient parchment between Elena's fingers as she spread it across the saloon's largest table. The document, dated 1887, bore official seals and signatures, but the story it told was written in blood rather than ink. Doc Harrison adjusted his spectacles while Sheriff Martinez leaned forward, studying the faded text that would change everything they thought they knew about their town's history. Where did you get this? Doc Harrison asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's dark eyes reflected the lamplight as she traced the deed's borders with her fingertip. My grandmother kept it hidden for 60 years. She made me promise to only bring it out if the curse ever returned. She looked at Caleb, who sat slumped in a chair nearby, his condition visibly deteriorating. I think it's safe to say that time has come. The deed established clear ownership of the Blackwater Canyon territory, not to the territorial government or any white settlers, but to Joseph Crowfeather and his people. The land had been officially recognized as a sacred site, protected by federal treaty and territorial law. What made the document even more significant were the amendments scrawled in the margins. written in a different hand and dated just days before Joseph's death. According to this, Sheriff Martinez said, running his finger along the margin notes, Joseph tried to sell the land to prevent bloodshed. Look here, he was negotiating with representatives from 3 different cattle operations. The Peterson spread, the Thornton Ranch, and ... double quotes. Doc Harrison squinted at the faded ink. The Martinez Holdings. The sheriff's face went pale. That's impossible. My family didn't arrive in this territory until 1895. Elena shook her head slowly. Your great-grandfather, Eduardo Martinez, was one of the original land commissioners. He's listed here as a witness to the negotiations. The weight of inherited guilt settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Sheriff Martinez sat down heavily, his hand shaking slightly as he studied the document that implicated his own bloodline in events he'd never heard whispered about, even in family stories, passed down through generations. There's more, Elena continued, turning the deed over to reveal a hand-drawn map on the back. This shows the exact boundaries of the sacred ground, and look. She pointed to a small X marked in red ink. This is where Joseph was performing his final ritual when they killed him. Caleb stirred in his chair, drawn by a sensation he couldn't quite name. As Elena's finger touched the X on the map, the larvae in his foot began moving more actively, almost as if responding to some invisible signal. He could feel them spreading small movements beneath the skin of his leg, a crawling sensation. That made his stomach turn. The stone marker, he said suddenly. The one I found the cattle gathered around. It has to be the same place. Doc Harrison opened his medical journal and made another entry, noting the time and Caleb's reaction, too. The map. In 30 years of practice, he'd learned to document everything, especially when dealing with cases that defied medical explanation. According to my grandmother's stories, Elena said, Joseph wasn't just protecting the land from development. He was guarding something specific, a burial ground where his people's ancestors rested. The ritual he was performing was meant to ensure their eternal peace. And someone interrupted that ritual, Sheriff Martinez said grimly. Not just interrupted. They murdered him while he was calling on the spirits for protection. My grandmother saw it happen from her hiding place in the rocks. She said Joseph's blood mixed with the ceremonial herbs he'd scattered on the ground. And when he died, something changed in the very earth itself. Outside, the wind had picked up again, sending tumbleweeds rolling down Main Street and causing the saloon sign to creak ominously. The sound seemed to echo the groaning that had started deep in Caleb's chest. The sound seemed to echo the groaning that had started deep in Caleb's chest. A noise that didn't sound entirely human. Elena moved to the bar and retrieved an ornate wooden box from beneath the counter. Inside, wrapped in faded silk, lay several items that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a frontier saloon. There were bundles of dried herbs, small carved stones, and at the center, a piece of fabric stained dark brown with what could only be blood. These belonged to Joseph, she explained. My grandmother managed to gather some of his things before the men came back to burn his camp. She's been keeping them safe, waiting for someone who could use them to set things right. Doc Harrison leaned forward to examine the artifacts. What exactly did your grandmother think someone could do? Complete the ritual. Joseph died before he could finish the protection spell. According to the old stories, his spirit has been trapped ever since, unable to rest while the sacred ground remains violated. Caleb groaned again, doubling over as a wave of pain shot through his entire body. When he looked up, his eyes had taken on a strange quality still recognizably his own, but with something else looking out from behind them. He's here, Caleb whispered, his voice rough and strained. Joseph, I can feel him trying to speak. The temperature in the saloon seemed to drop several degrees, and the oil lamps flickered despite the absence of any draft. Sheriff Martinez instinctively reached for his sidearm, then caught himself. What good would bullets do against a ghost? Elena approached Caleb slowly, the blood-stained fabric in her hands. If Joseph is trying to communicate, we need to listen. My grandmother taught me some of the old ways, enough to serve as a bridge between the living and the dead. She placed the fabric on Caleb's forehead, and immediately his body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, showing only the whites, and when he spoke again, it was with a voice that carried the weight of decades and the pain of unfinished business. They came in the night, the voice said through Caleb's lips. 3 families. Thornton, Martinez, Peterson. They wanted the land, but more than that, they wanted to erase the treaties that protected it. Sheriff Martinez stood up abruptly. This is impossible. My great-grandfather was an honorable man. Your great-grandfather stood by while they held me down and cut my throat, the voice continued. He held the torch while they burned my medicine lodge and scattered the bones of my ancestors. Doc Harrison continued taking notes, his medical training warring with the supernatural evidence before his eyes. The larvae in Caleb's foot were glowing now, pulsing with a pale light that seemed to match the rhythm of his possessed speech. The ritual, Elena said urgently. Tell us how to complete it. The sacred stone must be restored to its place. The families who participated in the murder must acknowledge their crime, and the land must be returned to its rightful guardians. The voice speaking through Caleb grew weaker. But beware, the curse I cast in my dying breath will claim the guilty and their bloodlines until justice is served. Caleb's body convulsed, and suddenly his own consciousness returned. He looked around the room with confusion and growing horror, as he noticed the glowing creatures beneath his skin. What's happening to me? He asked, his voice hoarse from channeling the dead man's words. Elena gently removed the blood-stained cloth from his forehead. You've become the vessel for Joseph's spirit. The curse is using you to communicate, but it's also transforming you into something else. Into what? Doc Harrison closed his journal with a snap. Into a guardian, I suspect. The same kind of protector Joseph was trying to create with his ritual. Sheriff Martinez paced to the window, staring out at the night sky. If what that spirit said is true, then my family, the Thorntons, and the Petersons are all in danger. More than danger, Elena corrected. The curse will spread until it claims every descendant of those who participated in Joseph's murder. You saw how it started with Caleb, but it won't end with him. As if to prove her point, a commotion erupted outside. Through the saloon windows, they could see people gathering in the street, their voices raised in alarm. Doc Harrison opened the door to hear what was happening. It's Wade Thornton, someone shouted. He's collapsed at his ranch house. Same symptoms as Caleb fever and something moving under his skin. Elena grabbed her shawl and the wooden box containing Joseph's artifacts. It's starting. The curse is claiming the bloodlines. How do we stop it? Sheriff Martinez asked, though the answer was already becoming clear. We complete the ritual Joseph started, Caleb said, struggling to his feet despite the pain. We restore the sacred stone, acknowledge the crimes, and return the land to its rightful guardians. And if we can't... Caleb looked down at his foot, where the larvae had grown noticeably larger and more active. He could feel them throughout his body now, changing him in ways he didn't fully understand, but instinctively feared. Then everyone connected to those 3 families will share my fate, he said simply, and Marrow Creek will become a graveyard. The deed still lay spread across the table, its faded ink and official seals a testament to broken promises and spilled blood. But it was more than just a historical document now. It was a roadmap to redemption, if they could follow it before the curse consumed them all. Outside, the wind carried the sound of more voices, more panic, as the supernatural plague began to spread through the guilty bloodlines. Time was running out, and the ghost of Joseph Crowfeather would not be denied his justice much longer. The Historical Society of Marrow Creek occupied a modest adobe building on the outskirts of town, its walls lined with photographs, documents, and artifacts that told the story of the territory's settlement. Martha Prescott, the Society's elderly curator, moved among the displays with the careful steps of someone who understood the weight of preserved memory. When Doc Harrison and Caleb arrived at her door just after dawn, she took one look at the young man's deteriorating condition and ushered them inside without question. "I've been expecting this visit for 40 years, Martha said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades collecting the stories others preferred to forget. She was in her 70s, with silver hair pinned back in a practical bun and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "My mother warned me this day would come." She led them to a back room where boxes of unsorted materials waited in neat rows. From one of these, she withdrew a leather pouch that looked ancient beyond measure. The hide was darkened with age and wear, decorated with intricate beadwork and small feathers that somehow retained their vibrant colors despite the passage of time. "This belonged to Joseph Crow Feather," Martha explained, placing the medicine pouch on a nearby table. "It was found buried near where his camp once stood. The sheriff at the time, not Martinez's great-grandfather, but his predecessor, wanted to destroy it. My mother convinced him to let her keep it instead." Caleb approached the pouch slowly, drawn by the same inexplicable force that had guided him to the stone marker in Blackwater Canyon. As his fingers made contact with the ancient leather, a jolt of energy coursed through his body, and suddenly he could see. The vision came in fragments, like looking through shattered glass. He saw Joseph Crow Feather as he had been in life, a man of perhaps 50 years, with weathered hands and kind eyes, his long black hair streaked with silver. Joseph knelt beside the sacred stone marker, arranging herbs and small objects in a precise pattern while chanting in a language Caleb had never heard, but somehow understood. "He was trying to create a barrier," Caleb said, his voice distant as the vision continued. "Not just to protect the burial ground, but to guard against something darker, something he sensed was coming." Martha nodded knowingly. The gold rush of 1886 brought all kinds of men to this territory, good men and evil ones alike. Joseph had the gift of sight. He could sense the intentions of those around him. In the vision, Caleb saw 3 riders approaching Joseph's camp, under cover of darkness. They moved with the careful deliberation of men who had planned their actions well in advance. The leader was a tall man with a thick mustache and cold eyes, someone Caleb instinctively knew was Wade Thornton's grandfather. Behind him rode a younger man with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, undoubtedly Eduardo Martinez, and a third figure whose face remained shadowed. "They didn't come to negotiate," Caleb continued, watching the scene unfold in his mind. "They came to silence him permanently." Doc Harrison made careful notes as Caleb described the vision, recognizing the importance of documenting every detail. The larvae in the young man's foot had begun to pulse more rapidly, almost as if feeding off the spiritual energy released by the medicine pouch. "What happened next?" Martha asked, though from the expression on her weathered face, she already knew the answer would be terrible. Caleb's body tensed as the vision reached its climax. He saw Joseph rising from his ritual circle, not with fear but with sad resignation, as if he had foreseen this moment in his prayers. The healer made no attempt to flee or fight. Instead, he continued chanting, his voice growing stronger even as the 3 men dismounted and drew their weapons. "He knew he was going to die," Caleb whispered, "but he also knew his death would complete a different kind of ritual. The protection spell he'd been weaving, it needed blood and sacrifice to reach its full power." The vision shifted, and Caleb saw through Joseph's eyes as the blade drew across his throat. But even as his life ebbed away, the healer's spirit remained connected to the sacred stone, to the herbs scattered around it, and to the ancient burial ground he had died defending. With his final breath, Joseph bound his soul to the land itself, creating a curse that would lie dormant until the guilty bloodlines grew strong enough to threaten the sacred ground again. The medicine pouch, Martha said as Caleb's vision began to fade. It contained some of the same herbs Joseph was using in his final ritual. Sage, sweetgrass, and something else, something that only grows in places where innocent blood has been spilled. Caleb opened the pouch with trembling fingers. Inside, he found bundles of dried herbs, small carved stones, and a collection of beads that seemed to shift color in the lamplight. But at the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of doeskin, was something that made his heart race, a fragment of the sacred stone marker, broken off and preserved like a holy relic. The moment his skin touched the stone fragment, another vision struck him, this one more intense than the first. He saw the aftermath of Joseph's murder, witnessed by a young woman hidden among the rocks. She was beautiful, with long dark hair and traditional dress, unmistakably Elena's grandmother. Maria Santos. Maria watched in horror as the three men dragged Joseph's body away from the ritual circle and threw it into a shallow grave. But they made a crucial mistake. They left the sacred stone marker intact, along with the herbs and blood that had soaked into the earth around it. As they rode away, Maria crept from her hiding place and began gathering what remained of Joseph's possessions, including the fragment that now rested in Caleb's palm. She saved what she could, Caleb said, coming out of the second vision. Elena's grandmother, she knew the ritual wasn't finished, that Joseph's spirit would need these things if justice was ever to be served. Martha reached into another box and withdrew a photograph so old its edges were brown with age. The image showed a group of men standing around the sacred stone marker, their faces stern and triumphant. They had posed for the camera as if commemorating a great victory, unaware that their crime had been witnessed and that their descendants would one day pay for their cruelty. My mother took this picture, Martha explained. She was working as a photographer's assistant in those days, documenting the territory's development. She followed the men back to the sacred site the next morning, thinking they might want to commemorate their new land acquisition. The photograph was damning evidence of the conspiracy. Caleb could clearly identify Wade Thornton's grandfather and Eduardo Martinez, along with a third man whose features bore a strong resemblance to the current Peterson family. They stood with rifles in hand, their boots planted firmly on ground still dark with Joseph's blood. "This is proof," Doc Harrison said, studying the photograph. "Legal evidence that could be used to establish the family's guilt. Evidence of, what crime?" Martha asked pointedly. Joseph Crowfeather's murder was never officially investigated. As far as the territorial records show, he simply disappeared one day, and his land was eventually claimed for non-payment of taxes. Caleb felt the larvae stirring more actively throughout his body now, spreading from his foot up into his leg and across his torso. The transformation was accelerating, driven by his growing connection to Joseph's spirit and the sacred artifacts. We need to find the other descendants," he said urgently. "If the curse is spreading to all the guilty bloodlines, then Wade Thornton and whoever represents the Peterson family need to know what they're facing." Martha packed the medicine pouch and the photograph into a canvas bag. Wade Thornton owns the largest cattle operation in 3 counties now. His great-grandfather's crime has brought him wealth and power, but it's also marked his family for spiritual justice. And the Petersons? The Peterson spread was sold years ago, but the family is still in the area. Emma Peterson runs the general store now. She's a good woman, but she needs to face the truth about her ancestors' actions. Doc Harrison helped Caleb to his feet, noting how much more difficult movement had become for the young man. The infection or transformation or whatever supernatural process was occurring was accelerating at an alarming rate. "How much time do we have?" Caleb asked. Martha looked at him with the combination of compassion and hard-won wisdom that came from a lifetime of studying history's darker chapters. According to the stories my mother passed down, the curse follows the moon cycle. You have until the next new moon to complete Joseph's ritual or become its final sacrifice. Outside, the sound of horses and raised voices indicated that word of the supernatural plague was spreading through Marrow Creek. People were frightened, and frightened people often made desperate choices. "We need to move quickly," Doc Harrison said, shouldering the bag containing the artifacts. "If this situation gets out of hand, the townspeople might decide that the simplest solution is to eliminate the infected." Caleb touched the stone fragment one more time, feeling Joseph's presence strengthen within him. The murdered healer's spirit was growing more powerful, fed by the return of his sacred possessions and the approach of cosmic justice. But with that power came the risk that Caleb himself might be consumed in the process of channeling it. "Then let's find Wade Thornton," he said, his voice carrying new strength despite his physical deterioration. "It's time for the guilty families to face what their ancestors did." The medicine pouch seemed to pulse with its own life as they prepared to leave the Historical Society building. Inside, Joseph Crowfeather's spirit stirred like a sleeping giant awakening to reclaim what had been stolen. The curse was no longer dormant. It was actively hunting the bloodlines that had escaped justice for far too long. The faded photograph trembled in Wade Thornton's weathered hands as he stared at the image of his great-grandfather standing triumphantly over Joseph Crowfeather's blood-soaked grave. The cattle baron was a man accustomed to control. His vast ranch empire built on the foundation of what he'd always believed was legitimate land acquisition. Now, facing the undeniable evidence of his family's original sin, his world was cracking apart like drought-stricken earth. "This can't be real," Wade whispered, though the larvae writhing beneath the skin of his forearms told a different story. The supernatural infection had taken hold of him just as it had Caleb, marking him as another descendant of the guilty bloodlines. "My great-grandfather was a pioneer, a builder of civilization in the wilderness." Doc Harrison studied Wade's symptoms with the clinical detachment that 30 years of frontier medicine had taught him. The rancher's condition was progressing differently than Caleb's, where the young cowboy's infection had started in his foot. Wade's began in his hands, as if the curse understood that his family's crimes had been committed through violence and land grabbing. "Your great-grandfather was a murderer," Caleb said bluntly, his voice carrying the weight of Joseph's spiritual presence. "I've seen what happened that night. I felt the terror and pain of a holy man who died trying to protect sacred ground." They stood in the main room of Wade's ranch house, a sprawling adobe structure that spoke of wealth accumulated over generations. The walls were lined with portraits of Thornton ancestors, their faces stern and proud, unaware that their legacy was built on blood and betrayal. Outside, Wade's ranch hands went about their daily routines, oblivious to the supernatural crisis unfolding in their employer's home. Elena spread the ancient land deed across Wade's mahogany dining table, pointing to the signatures and seals. That proved the Blackwater Canyon territory had never legally belonged to the settling families. According to federal treaty, this land was protected in perpetuity. Your great-grandfather and his conspirators didn't just commit murder, they committed an act of treason against the United States government. Wade sank into a leather chair that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him, suddenly looking much older than his 58 years. The larvae beneath his skin pulsed visibly now, creating patterns that resembled the traditional beadwork found on Joseph's medicine pouch. "What do you want from me?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. "Truth," Caleb replied. "Acknowledgement of what your family did and commitment to make it right. And if I refuse?" Martha Prescott, who had accompanied them to Wade's ranch, opened her canvas bag and withdrew another artifact, a small wooden box carved with symbols that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight. Then the curse will consume you, just as it consumed the others who tried to deny their family's guilt. She opened the box to reveal a collection of what looked like dried flowers. But as the scent reached them, it became clear these were something far more significant. The flowers were perfectly preserved, despite their obvious age, and each one was stained with what could only be blood. "These are from the garlands Joseph was weaving when your ancestor killed him," Martha explained. "Part of the ritual meant to protect the sacred burial ground. They've been waiting all these years for someone to complete the ceremony." Wade reached toward the flowers, then pulled his hand back as if burned. "I can feel something," he said, his voice strained, like voices calling from a great distance. "The voices of your ancestors' victims," Elena said softly. "Joseph wasn't the only one who died that night. There were others members of his community who tried to defend the sacred ground. Your great-grandfather and his partners killed them all." The revelation hit Wade like a physical blow. He doubled over, clutching his chest as the larvae beneath his skin responded to the emotional trauma of inherited guilt. Through gritted teeth, he managed to ask, "How many others?" Caleb closed his eyes, allowing Joseph's spirit to guide him deeper into the memories preserved in the sacred artifacts. The vision that came was darker than the others, a systematic massacre designed to eliminate any witnesses to the land theft. 17 people, Caleb said, his voice hollow with the weight of ancient sorrow. Men, women, and children. They were camped near the sacred stone, celebrating a seasonal ceremony when your ancestors' group attacked. In the vision, Caleb saw the true scope of the conspiracy. It hadn't been a spontaneous act of greed, but a carefully planned campaign of ethnic cleansing. The three families had decided that the only way to claim the valuable land was to eliminate everyone who might challenge their ownership. They had struck during a religious festival, when Joseph's community was gathered and vulnerable. They burned the bodies, Caleb continued, his own voice mixing with Joseph's spiritual presence, threw them into a ravine and covered them with rocks, then spread word that the tribe had moved on to other territories. The territorial authorities never investigated because Eduardo Martinez, as a land commissioner, filed reports claiming the area was uninhabited. Wade's face had gone ashen, and the larvae beneath his skin were now clearly visible, writhing like snakes trapped under a thin sheet. "My God," he whispered, "we're not just carrying the curse of one man's murder, we're carrying the weight of genocide." Doc Harrison made careful notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something unprecedented in his experience. The supernatural infection seemed to be responding to emotional trauma, growing stronger as each descendant faced the truth about their family's crimes. Elena approached Wade with the same gentle authority she'd shown when first examining Caleb's condition. "The curse isn't just about punishment," she said. "It's about justice." Joseph's final ritual was designed to ensure that the truth would eventually come to light and the victims would be properly honored. "What kind of justice?" Wade asked. "Recognition of the crime, restoration of the sacred ground, and protection to ensure nothing like this ever happens again," Elena replied. "But it has to come from the descendants themselves. The curse can force acknowledgement, but true healing requires voluntary confession and commitment to make amends." Martha closed the wooden box, but its presence continued to fill the room with an almost electric tension. "There are others you need to speak with," she told Wade. "Emma Peterson needs to hear this story, and Sheriff Martinez needs to understand his family's role in the cover-up. And if they refuse to acknowledge the truth..." Caleb looked down at his own body, where the larvae had now spread from his foot to his entire leg and were beginning to appear in his arms. His transformation was accelerating, driven by his role as the spiritual vessel for Joseph's justice. "Then the curse will claim them as it's claiming me," he said simply. "One way or another, the debt will be paid." Wade stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see his vast ranch stretching to the horizon. Everything he owned, everything his family had built, was founded on mass murder and land theft. The weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. "I need to see the place where it happened," he said finally. "I need to stand on that ground and face what my family did." Elena nodded approvingly. "The sacred stone marker is still there, though. It's been damaged by time and weather. Joseph's spirit is strongest in that place. If you're truly committed to making amends, that's where it needs to happen." "When?" "Soon," Caleb answered, feeling Joseph's urgency flowing through him. "The new moon is only days away. If we don't complete the ritual by then, the curse will become permanent. The infected will either die or transform into something that's no longer human." Wade touched one of the larvae moving beneath the skin of his forearm, wincing at the alien sensation. "Transform into what?" "Guardians," Martha said quietly. "Spiritual. Protectors bound to the sacred ground for eternity. It's what Joseph was trying to create with his original ritual, a supernatural force that would ensure the burial ground was never violated again." The implication was clear. If they failed to resolve the curse through acknowledgement and restitution, Caleb, Wade, and any other infected descendants would become eternal sentinels, neither fully alive nor completely dead, forever bound to protect the sacred territory that their ancestors had defiled. "Then we better find Emma Peterson and Sheriff Martinez quickly," Wade said, his voice carrying new determination. "If we're going to break this curse, we'll need all the guilty families to face the truth together." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the ranch yard. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Martinez riding hard toward the house, his face grim with purpose. Behind him rode a woman in her 40s with auburn hair and determined eyes, undoubtedly Emma Peterson. The third piece of the generational puzzle. The photograph seemed to pulse with its own dark energy as the descendants of all three. Conspirator. Families prepared to confront the truth their ancestors had tried to bury. The curse of Joseph Crowfeather was gathering momentum, and the time for half measures and denial was rapidly running out. Elena's grandmother's diary lay open on the kitchen table, its pages brittle with age, but its words burning with the intensity of witnessed horror. The leather-bound book had been hidden for decades in a secret compartment beneath the floorboards of Elena's bedroom, waiting for the day when the truth could no longer be contained. Now, as Sheriff Martinez and Emma Peterson joined the others around the table, the diary served as both historical record and instruction manual for confronting supernatural justice. Maria Santos wrote this in the days following Joseph's murder. Elena explained, her voice heavy with the weight of inherited trauma. She was there that night, hidden in the rocks, and she saw everything. Emma Peterson sat rigidly in her chair, her auburn hair pulled back severely, and her green eyes reflecting a mixture of disbelief and growing dread. As the owner of Marrow Creek's general store, she was accustomed to being at the center of the town's daily life, privy to its gossip and small dramas. But nothing had prepared her for the revelation that her family's prosperity was built on genocide. "This is impossible," Emma said, though the larvae beginning to appear beneath the skin of her neck told a different story. "My great-grandfather was a merchant, a peaceful man who sold supplies to travelers and settlers. Sheriff Martinez, whose own infection had begun manifesting as dark patterns spreading across his chest, shook his head grimly. According to this diary, your great-grandfather provided the weapons and supplies for the massacre. He knew exactly what was being planned." Elena began reading from her grandmother's careful script, translating the mix of Spanish and indigenous. Words that Maria had used to record the most traumatic night of her life. "The men came like shadows in the moonlight," Elena read. 3 leaders and perhaps a dozen followers, all armed with rifles and torches. They surrounded our camp while the people slept, children dreaming beside their parents, elders keeping. The sacred fires burning through the night. The diary's entries were detailed and precise, written by a woman who understood she might be the only witness to survive. Maria had watched from her hiding place as the systematic slaughter unfolded, recording not just the violence but the cold calculation behind it. Joseph knew they were coming, Elena continued. He had finished his evening prayers and was beginning the protection ritual when they attacked. My grandmother wrote that he never tried to run or fight. He just kept chanting, kept weaving the spiritual barrier that was meant to guard our people's bones. Doc Harrison studied the symptoms manifesting in the three descendants, noting how each person's infection seemed tailored to their ancestors' specific crime. Wade's hand showed the signs of violence. Sheriff Martinez's chest bore the patterns of complicity, and Emma's neck displayed the markings of someone whose family had profited from others' suffering. What exactly was the ritual Joseph was performing? Doc Harrison asked, his medical training demanding precise understanding, even in the face of supernatural phenomena. Elena turned to a page where her grandmother had attempted to sketch the ceremonial circle Joseph had been creating. The drawing showed the sacred stone marker at the center, surrounded by carefully placed herbs, carved objects, and what appeared to be drops of the healer's own blood. It was a binding ceremony, Elena explained. Joseph was trying to create a spiritual guardian for the burial ground, something that would protect the ancestors' bones from desecration and ensure the sacred land remained inviolate. But the ritual was interrupted, Caleb said, his voice carrying both his own awareness and Joseph's spiritual presence. When they killed him, the ceremony was only half complete. His spirit became trapped between the living world and the realm of the ancestors. Emma stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the peaceful main street of Marrow Creek. You're asking me to believe that my family's success in business, everything we've built over 3 generations, is cursed because of something my great-grandfather did before I was born. I'm not asking you to believe anything, Elena replied, quietly. I'm asking you to read the evidence and look at what's happening to your own body. Emma touched the larvae moving beneath her skin, wincing at the alien sensation. The creature seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, growing more active whenever she tried to deny or minimize her family's guilt. Sheriff Martinez opened his shirt to reveal the dark patterns spreading across his chest's intricate designs. That resembled the beadwork and symbols found on Joseph's sacred artifacts. My great-grandfather wasn't just a witness, he said heavily. According to this diary, he was the one who suggested burning the bodies to hide the evidence. The diary contained page after page of Maria's careful observations, written in the weeks and months following the massacre, as she struggled to understand what she had witnessed. She had returned to the sacred site multiple times, documenting how the land itself seemed to change in response to the violent desecration. The grass wouldn't grow where the blood was spilled, Elena read from another entry. Animals avoided the area, and the spring that had provided water for generations ran dry within a month. My grandmother knew the land was wounded, that Joseph's incomplete ritual had left it spiritually scarred. Wade Thornton, who had been silent since Sheriff Martinez and Emma arrived, finally spoke. What does the diary say about breaking the curse? Elena turned to the final pages, where Maria had recorded her desperate attempts to contact Joseph's spirit and understand what needed to be done. The handwriting here was more hurried, less precise, as if written under great emotional strain. The ritual must be completed, Elena read. The guilty families must acknowledge their crime, return what was stolen, and commit to protecting the sacred ground. Only then can Joseph's spirit find peace and release the land from his binding. Return what was stolen? Emma asked. The land belongs to dozens of different people now. It's been divided and sold so many times over the years. It's not about legal ownership, Caleb said, feeling Joseph's wisdom flowing through him. It's about spiritual recognition. The descendants need to publicly acknowledge what happened and commit to honoring the victims. Doc Harrison made another entry in his medical journal, noting how the supernatural infection seemed to respond to emotional states and spiritual revelations. The larvae in all three descendants had become more active as the truth emerged, as if feeding off the energy released by long-suppressed guilt. "There's something else," Elena said, turning to a page she had avoided reading aloud. "My grandmother wrote about the transformation that would occur if the ritual isn't completed by the new moon." The diary's description was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. According to Maria's account, those infected by the curse would gradually lose their human form and become eternal guardians of the sacred land spirits bound to protect the burial ground until the end of time. "We would become like Joseph," Caleb said, understanding flooding through him, trapped between life and death, forever guarding what our ancestors tried to destroy. "How long do we have?" Wade asked. Elena consulted a calendar hanging on the kitchen wall, counting the days until the lunar cycle completed. 4 days until the new moon. "If we can't complete the ritual by then, the transformation becomes irreversible." Sheriff Martinez stood up, his law enforcement training asserting itself even in the face of supernatural crisis. "Then we need to organize this properly. We need to gather the sacred artifacts, identify the exact location where the ritual must be performed, and make sure all the necessary participants are prepared." "It's not just about the three families," Emma said, beginning to accept the reality of their situation. According to the diary, the entire community needs to witness the deifties the finest the podustas the diary. The entire community needs to witness the dash acknowledgement of guilt. "The curse affects everyone because the cover-up involved the whole town." Elena nodded gravely. "My grandmother wrote, the justice delayed is justice amplified. The longer the truth was hidden, the more powerful Joseph's binding became. Now it's strong enough to transform not just individuals, but the entire spiritual landscape of the region." Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across Marrow Creek's dusty streets. The town looked peaceful and ordinary, but beneath its surface, supernatural forces were stirring. The curse that had lain dormant for over a century was reaching its full power, and time was running out for both the living and the dead to find resolution. "We need to go to Blackwater Canyon," Caleb said, his transformation accelerating as Joseph's presence grew stronger within him. "We need to stand on the sacred ground and face what our families did. Only there can the ritual be completed and justice finally served." The diary seemed to pulse with its own life as the descendants of the guilty families prepared to confront the full weight of inherited sin. Maria Santos had preserved not just the historical record, but the spiritual roadmap, needed to break a curse that had claimed too many lives already. Whether they had the courage to follow that roadmap remained to be seen. The sacred stone marker emerged from the earth like the backbone of some ancient beast, its weathered surface carved with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the flickering torchlight. After decades buried beneath accumulated soil and debris, the monument stood revealed once more, emanating a power that made the air itself feel electric with spiritual energy. Caleb knelt beside it, his hands trembling as he brushed away the last of the dirt that had hidden Joseph Crow Feather's most sacred artifact. The expedition to Blackwater Canyon had taken most of the day, with Wade Thornton leading them through terrain that had been deliberately avoided by locals for generations. The landscape itself seemed hostile to their presence. Thorny undergrowth that snagged at their clothing, loose rocks that shifted treacherously underfoot, and an oppressive silence that suggested they were being watched by unseen eyes. "My God," Sheriff Martinez breathed, staring at the monument that his great-grandfather had helped desecrate. "It's beautiful." The stone stood nearly 6 feet tall, its surface covered with intricate carvings that told the story of the land and its people. There were images of buffalo and eagles, symbols representing the four directions, and at the very top, a figure that could only be Joseph Crowfeather himself, arms raised toward the sky in eternal supplication. Emma Peterson approached the marker, cautiously, her infection having progressed to the point where the larvae were visible through her skin like dark veins mapping her guilt. How did something this magnificent get buried and forgotten? It wasn't forgotten, Elena replied, consulting her grandmother's diary for guidance on what they would find. It was deliberately hidden. After the massacre, the three families tried to destroy it, but the stone was too hard and their tools too primitive. So they buried it instead, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. Doc Harrison circled the monument, making notes and sketches in his journal. The medical man in him was fascinated by the physical manifestation of spiritual power, while the healer in him recognized that they were standing at the epicenter of both ancient trauma and potential redemption. The markings are more than just decoration, he observed. They form a kind of map or instruction manual. Look here. He pointed to a series of symbols near the base. These show the placement of ritual objects, and these others indicate the proper positioning of participants. Caleb pressed his palms against the stone surface, and immediately his consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of his individual awareness. Through Joseph's spiritual connection, he could perceive the sacred site as it had been on that terrible night over a century ago, not the barren, haunted place it had become, but a vibrant center of community life and spiritual power. In his expanded vision, Caleb saw the seasonal ceremony that had been taking place when the attackers struck. Families gathered around cooking fires, children playing games that taught them about their heritage, elders sharing stories that connected them to countless generations of ancestors. Joseph himself had been the spiritual heart of the community, a man who bridged the gap between the living and the dead, between the earthly realm and the sacred mysteries. There were 17 victims, Caleb said, his voice carrying the authority of witnessed truth. But they weren't the only ones who died that night. The attack destroyed an entire way of life, a spiritual tradition that had maintained balance in this land for thousands of years. Wade Thornton stood apart from the others, his cattle rancher's practical mind struggling to process the evidence of his family's crimes. The infection in his hands had progressed to the point where the larvae were clearly visible, writhing beneath his skin like living tattoos that told the story of violence and theft. What exactly happened here? He asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. Elena opened her grandmother's diary to the pages that contained Maria's most detailed account of the massacre. The witness testimony was horrific in its precision, recording not just the violence, but the methodical way it had been carried out. They came at dawn, Elena read, translating her grandmother's Spanish text. Joseph had been keeping vigil all night, performing the protection ceremony that would shield our people from the evil he sensed approaching. The three leaders rode straight to the sacred stone, knowing it was the spiritual heart of our community. In Caleb's vision, he watched as the younger Eduardo Martinez dismounted and approached Joseph with what looked like an attempt at negotiation. But the healer had seen through the deception, recognizing that no true bargaining was possible with men whose hearts were already committed to murder. Joseph offered them everything, Caleb continued, speaking both from the vision and from the spiritual knowledge flowing through him. He was willing to relocate his people, to find other land, where they could continue their ceremonies. He even offered to perform blessings for their cattle and crops, to share the spiritual wisdom that could help their settlements prosper. But they refused, Sheriff Martinez said, his voice heavy with inherited shame. Worse than refused, Elena replied, reading further in the diary. According to my grandmother, the elder Thornton laughed at Joseph's offer. He said the only good Indian was a dead Indian, and that they intended to make sure no natives ever returned to claim this territory. The sacred stone seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat as the descendants of the guilty families confronted the full scope of their ancestors' crimes. The larvae beneath their skin responded to the emotional trauma, growing more active and visible as suppressed guilt rose to the surface. Emma Peterson approached the monument and placed her hand on one of the carved symbols, an image of a merchant's scales that seemed grotesquely appropriate for her family's role in the massacre. "My great-grandfather provided the weapons," she said quietly. "The rifles, the ammunition, even the rope they used to bind the victims. And my great-grandfather used his authority as a land commissioner to cover up the crime," Sheriff Martinez added. "He filed false reports claiming the area was uninhabited, then helped divide the land among the conspirators." Wade Thornton was the last to approach the stone, his rancher's boots heavy on ground that had been soaked with innocent blood. When he placed his hands on the monument, the larvae beneath his skin began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence that matched the spiritual energy emanating from the carved symbols. "My great-grandfather was the leader," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. "He organized the whole thing, convinced the others that murder was justified if it meant claiming valuable grazing land." As each descendant acknowledged their families' guilt, the sacred stone began to resonate with increasing power. The air around them shimmered with heat distortion, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with the rhythm of an enormous heartbeat. Joseph Crowfeather's spirit was growing stronger, fed by the admissions of truth that had been denied for over a century. Doc Harrison stepped back from the monument, recognizing that they were witnessing something beyond his medical understanding. "The transformation is accelerating," he observed, studying the three infected descendants. "Acknowledging the truth seems to be triggering the final phase of the curse." Elena consulted her grandmother's diary, searching for guidance on what should happen next. According to Maria's account, the ritual required more than just admission of guilt. It demanded active commitment to making amends and ensuring that such atrocities could never happen again. "The stone needs to be restored to its full power," Elena said, reading from the diary's final pages. Joseph's original ritual was designed to create a spiritual guardian, but that guardian can only function if the sacred site is properly consecrated. Caleb felt Joseph's presence growing stronger within him, the murdered healer's consciousness merging more completely with his own. Through their combined awareness, he could sense what the land needed, not just acknowledgement of past crimes, but active protection against future desecration. "We need the other artifacts," he said, his voice carrying Joseph's authority. "The medicine pouch, the blood-stained fabric, the preserved flowers. Everything that connects us to that night needs to be brought together here at the stone." "And then what?" Wade asked, watching the larvae beneath his skin form patterns that resembled the monument's carved symbols. "Then we complete the ritual Joseph started," Caleb replied. "We transform the curse from an instrument of vengeance into a force of protection. But it requires sacrifice from each of the guilty bloodlines, something precious that represents what your families gained through murder." The implication was clear. Breaking the curse wouldn't just require acknowledging historical guilt. Would demand giving up the wealth and power that had been built on that foundation of blood and betrayal. The descendants would have to choose between their inherited prosperity and their humanity. As the sun began to set over Blackwater Canyon, the sacred stone marker stood like a beacon calling for justice across the decades. The spirits of 17 murder victims waited in the gathering darkness, while the living struggled with the weight of inherited sin and the price of redemption. Time was running short, and the choices made in the next few hours would determine not just the fate of 3 families, but the spiritual balance of the entire region. Sheriff Martinez's badge felt heavier than lead in his trembling hands as he stared at the dark stains that marred its once bright surface. The Tin Star had been passed down through 3 generations of lawmen in his family, a symbol of honor and public service that now revealed itself as something far more sinister. Under the sacred stone's spiritual illumination, The old blood stains were clearly visible, evidence that his great-grandfather had not merely witnessed Joseph Crowfeather's murder, but had participated directly in the killing. "This can't be right," Martinez whispered, though the larvae spreading across his chest were forming patterns that perfectly matched the badge's six-pointed design. Eduardo Martinez was a respected peace officer, appointed by the territorial governor himself. Doc Harrison examined the badge through his magnifying glass, his medical training allowing him to identify the biological evidence that time and careful polishing had failed to erase completely. "These stains are definitely blood," he confirmed grimly. "And given their age and distribution pattern, I'd say this badge was worn during a violent struggle." Elena consulted her grandmother's diary with growing urgency, searching for any mention of Eduardo Martinez's role in the massacre that might have been overlooked in previous readings. What she found in the margins of Maria's careful script sent a chill down her spine. "My grandmother wrote something in Apache here," Elena said, translating the faded words. "She says Eduardo Martinez wasn't just a witness or accomplice, was the one who cut Joseph's throat while the others held him down." The revelation hit Sheriff Martinez like a physical blow. He doubled over, clutching his chest as the larvae beneath his skin responded to the emotional trauma of complete truth. The infection that had begun as dark patterns was now spreading rapidly, creating intricate designs that resembled traditional law enforcement symbols corrupted by violence and betrayal. Caleb felt Joseph's spirit surge with renewed power as another layer of deception was stripped away. Through their shared consciousness, he could see the night of the massacre with perfect clarity, not just the violence itself, but the careful planning and role assignments that had preceded it. "Your great-grandfather volunteered for the task," Caleb said, his voice carrying Joseph's memories. "He said a lawman's blade would make the killing look like official justice rather than murder." Wade Thornton and Emma Peterson stared at Sheriff Martinez with a mixture of horror and recognition. If the conspiracy had been deeper and more organized than they had imagined, what other secrets might their own families be hiding? "There's more," Elena said, turning to pages in the diary that she had previously assumed contained only personal reflections. "My grandmother wrote about the planning meetings that took place before the attack. They weren't spontaneous acts of greed. They were carefully orchestrated to look like legitimate law enforcement actions." According to Maria's account, the three family leaders had spent months developing their plan. They had identified Joseph as the primary obstacle to their land acquisition schemes and had devised a strategy that would eliminate him while providing legal cover for their actions. "They forged documents," Elena read from the diary, "created fake warrants claiming Joseph was wanted for cattle theft and inciting rebellion among the local tribes. Eduardo Martinez was supposed to arrest him, but the plan was always to kill him during the alleged escape attempt." Doc Harrison made careful notes as the full scope of the conspiracy revealed itself. What had appeared to be a simple case of frontier justice was actually a sophisticated frame-up designed to justify genocide. "But something went wrong," Caleb said, channeling Joseph's memories. When they arrived at the sacred site, Joseph was performing the protection ritual. He wasn't running or resisting. He was kneeling beside the stone marker, completely absorbed in his spiritual work. "So they had to improvise," Sheriff Martinez said, his voice hollow with shame. "Instead of staging an arrest gone wrong, they had to commit outright murder in front of 17 witnesses. Which meant they had to kill everyone," Wade added, understanding dawning in his eyes. "The massacre wasn't part of the original plan, it was damage control." Elena's grandmother had hidden this truth for decades, understanding that the full revelation of law enforcement corruption would destroy any possibility of justice through official channels. The conspiracy had reached into the very institutions meant to protect the innocent, making them complicit in their destruction. "The badge contains more than just blood," Doc Harrison observed, studying it under different angles of light. There are traces of the herbs Joseph was using in his ritual. Your great-grandfather must have knelt beside him during the murder, contaminating the sacred ceremony with corrupt authority. Sheriff Martinez looked at his own hands, where similar traces of ancient herbs had begun to appear beneath his skin alongside the larvae. The curse wasn't just punishing him for his ancestors' violence. It was marking him as someone who had inherited the corruption of justice itself. "This changes everything," Emma Peterson said, her voice strained with the effort of processing the implications. If the territorial law enforcement was involved from the beginning, then the cover-up wasn't just about hiding murder. It was about protecting the entire system of frontier justice. Caleb pressed his palms against the sacred stone marker, allowing Joseph's consciousness to merge more completely with his own. Through their combined awareness, he could see the broader pattern of corruption that had enabled the massacre. It wasn't limited to Marrow Creek, he said, his voice carrying the authority of spiritual revelation. This was happening throughout the territory. Native communities were being systematically eliminated through coordinated actions between corrupt officials and land-hungry settlers. The sacred stone began to pulse with increasing intensity as the full truth emerged. Joseph's protection ritual hadn't just been designed to guard one burial ground. It had been meant to create a spiritual barrier against the wave of genocide sweeping across the entire region. "The other artifacts," Elena said urgently, consulting her grandmother's diary. "They're not just memorial objects. They're components of a much larger spiritual working." Joseph was trying to create a network of protection that would shield all the sacred sites from desecration. Doc Harrison studied the badge through his magnifying glass again, noting details he had missed in his initial examination. "There are symbols engraved on the back," he announced. "They look similar to the carvings on the stone marker." Sheriff Martinez turned the badge over, revealing intricate designs that had been carefully hidden beneath decades of careful polishing. The symbols matched those on Joseph's medicine pouch and the sacred stone, suggesting a connection that went far deeper than simple murder and theft. "Eduardo Martinez knew about the ritual," Caleb said, Joseph's memories flowing through him like a river of fire. He understood the spiritual significance of what Joseph was doing, and he deliberately corrupted it by spilling blood on his sacred herbs. Why would he do that? Because he was trying to turn the protection spell into a weapon, Elena answered, finding the relevant passage in her grandmother's diary. According to Maria, Eduardo believed that if he could corrupt Joseph's ritual, he could claim the spiritual power for himself and his descendants. The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. The conspiracy hadn't just been about stealing land. It had been an attempt to hijack and pervert the very spiritual forces meant to protect the innocent. But it backfired, Wade said, understanding flooding through him. Instead of gaining power, Eduardo's family was marked for destruction along with the rest of us. Sheriff Martinez looked at the badge with new horror, recognizing it not as a symbol of honor, but as a cursed talisman that had corrupted 3 generations of his family's service to the law. "We haven't just been carrying guilt," he said. "We've been carrying spiritual poison that's infected everything we've touched." The larvae beneath his skin were glowing now, pulsing in rhythm with the sacred stone's power. But unlike the others, whose infections seemed focused and purposeful, his transformation was chaotic and painful, the result of spiritual forces that had been twisted from their original intent. The curse isn't just seeking justice, Doc Harrison realized, watching the different patterns of infection manifesting in each descendant. It's trying to purify the corruption that Eduardo introduced into the original ritual. Caleb felt Joseph's presence growing stronger, the murdered healer's consciousness becoming more dominant in their shared awareness. Through their merged perception, he could see what needed to happen next, not just the completion of the protection ritual, but the active reversal of the spiritual corruption that had poisoned the sacred site for over a century. "We need to burn the badge," he said, his voice carrying absolute certainty, "and any other artifacts that were contaminated by Eduardo's betrayal. The curse can't be broken until the spiritual poison is purged from the sacred ground." Sheriff Martinez held the badge up to the torchlight, seeing it clearly for the first time in his life. It wasn't a symbol of justice. It was a tumor on the spiritual landscape, a cancer that had been spreading its corruption through his family line for generations. "Then let's purge it," he said, his voice carrying new strength despite the pain of his accelerating transformation. "Let's burn away the lies and face the truth, no matter how much it hurts." The sacred stone marker pulsed with approval, its carved symbol seeming to dance in the flickering light. Joseph Crow Feather's spirit was preparing for the final phase of his interrupted ritual, a cleansing fire that would either purify the sacred ground or consume everyone who had been marked by the curse of inherited guilt. Joseph Crow Feather's ritual staff lay in 3 pieces across Elena's kitchen table, each fragment glowing with its own spiritual energy as the new moon approached. The ancient ceremonial tool had been deliberately broken after the healer's murder, its pieces scattered to prevent anyone from completing the protection ritual that would have shielded the sacred lands from further desecration. Now, with less than 24 hours remaining before the curse became permanent, the desperate search for the final fragment had led them to the most unlikely of places. Wade Thornton held the largest piece, the staff's carved head, which depicted an eagle in flight surrounded by symbols representing the 4 directions. He had found it buried beneath the foundation stones of his ranch house, hidden there by his guilt-ridden great-grandfather as either trophy or attempt at containment. The wood felt warm to the touch, almost alive, and when he gripped it tightly, he could hear whispers in a language he didn't understand but somehow felt in his bones. "The second piece was in my family's vault all along," Emma Peterson said, cradling the middle section of the staff. The carved shaft bore intricate patterns that seemed to shift and move in the lamplight, depicting the cycle of seasons and the eternal dance between life and death. "My great-grandfather kept it locked away with his most valuable possessions, probably thinking it was made of precious wood or contained gold." Sheriff Martinez held the final piece, the staff's pointed base, which was meant to be driven into the earth during ceremonies to channel spiritual energy from the sacred ground itself. The corruption that had marked his family's bloodline was most visible when he touched this fragment, the larvae beneath his skin forming dark patterns that seemed to resist the staff's purifying influence. "They're calling to each other," Caleb observed, his transformation now so advanced that Joseph's presence was clearly visible in his eyes. "The pieces want to be reunited. I can feel the staff's power trying to reassemble itself." Doc Harrison documented each fragment with careful sketches and notes, his scientific mind struggling to quantify the spiritual phenomena he was witnessing. The ritual staff wasn't just an artifact. It was a conduit for forces that existed beyond the boundaries of medical understanding. "According to your grandmother's diary," Doc Harrison said to Elena, "the staff needs to be whole before the protection ritual can be completed. But the reassembly itself is dangerous. It could trigger the final transformation before we're ready." Elena consulted the diary's final pages, where Maria Santos had recorded her conversations with other survivors of similar massacres throughout the territory. The genocide had been systematic and widespread, but in a few cases, indigenous communities had managed to preserve their sacred artifacts and complete interrupted rituals. "The staff must be reassembled at the sacred stone marker," Elena read, "but only by someone who carries both the blood of the guilty and the spirit of the innocent. The ritual requires a bridge between the living and the dead, between the perpetrators and the victims." All eyes turned to Caleb, whose transformation had progressed far beyond the others. The larvae beneath his skin had formed complex patterns that resembled both traditional indigenous artwork and the symptoms of some otherworldly disease. His humanity was slipping away, replaced by something that existed in the space between life and death. "I can feel him," Caleb said, his voice carrying layers of meaning that belonged to both himself and Joseph Crowfeather. The ritual isn't just about justice, it's about balance. The violence that was done created a wound in the spiritual fabric of this place. Completing the ceremony will either heal that wound or tear it open completely. Wade Thornton studied, the staff fragment in his hands, feeling the weight of inherited responsibility. His family's wealth and power had been built on the foundation of murder and theft. But giving up that legacy might be the only way to prevent a supernatural catastrophe that would consume the entire region. "What exactly will happen when we put the staff together?" he asked. "The spirits of the 17 victims will be able to manifest fully," Elena replied, translating her grandmother's most detailed account of similar rituals. "They'll judge whether our acknowledgement of guilt and commitment to make amends is genuine. If they find us worthy, the curse will be transformed into a blessing that protects the sacred lands forever. And if they find us unworthy?" Caleb's eyes blazed with otherworldly fire as Joseph's consciousness became more dominant. "Then the transformation will be completed, and we'll become eternal guardians ourselves, neither fully alive nor completely dead, bound to protect the sacred ground until the end of time." Sheriff Martinez felt the corrupted badge burning against his chest where he had pinned it inside his shirt. The cursed talisman seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, fighting against the staff's purifying influence. "There's something else we haven't considered," he said. "What if the spirits don't just judge us? What if they judge the entire town?" The possibility sent a chill through the room. Marrow Creek had been built on the foundation of covered-up genocide, its prosperity dependent on the systematic erasure of indigenous presence from the region. If the spirits of the victims demanded broader justice, the supernatural reckoning could extend far beyond the 3 guilty families. "We need to prepare the entire community," Elena said, understanding the implications. "Everyone needs to know what happened and what's at stake. The ritual won't work if it's performed in secret. It requires witnesses, acknowledgement from the whole society that benefited from the original crime." Doc Harrison checked his pocket watch, noting how little time remained before the new moon would seal their fate permanently. "How do we convince an entire town to accept responsibility for something their ancestors did over a century ago?" "By showing them what happens if we don't," Caleb replied, his voice carrying the authority of approaching supernatural justice. "The curse is already spreading beyond the guilty bloodlines. I can feel it touching everyone who lives on the stolen land, everyone who profits from the covered-up genocide." As if to prove his point, Martha Prescott burst through the kitchen door, her face pale with terror. "It's happening all over town," she announced breathlessly. "People are showing symptoms, the larvae, the fever, the visions. It's not just the 3 families anymore." Elena grabbed her grandmother's diary and flipped to the passages dealing with the curse's expansion. According to Maria, the spiritual contamination spreads in waves. First the direct descendants, then their associates, and finally everyone who lives on the defiled ground. "How long do we have?" Wade asked. "Until midnight," Martha replied. "That's when the new moon reaches its peak. After that, anyone who's been touched by the curse will begin the final transformation." Sheriff Martinez stood up abruptly, his law enforcement training asserting itself despite the supernatural nature of the crisis. "Then we need to organize this like any other emergency. Gather everyone in the town square, tell them the truth, and give them a chance to be part of the solution." "And if they refuse to believe us?" Emma asked. Caleb held up his hands, where the larvae had begun to glow with phosphorescent light. "They'll believe us," he said simply. "The truth has a way of making itself known, especially when it's been buried for too long." Elena packed the diary and the other sacred artifacts into her canvas bag, preparing for what might be the most important ceremony in the region's history. "We need to move the ritual to the town square," she said. "The sacred stone marker is too far away, and we don't have time to transport everyone to Blackwater Canyon. But will the ritual work without the stone?" Doc Harrison asked. "The power isn't in the location," Caleb replied, Joseph's wisdom flowing through him. "It's in the acknowledgement of truth and the commitment to justice. We can consecrate any ground by bringing the sacred artifacts together and speaking the words that have been waiting over a century to be said." Outside, the sun was setting on what might be the last normal day in Marrow Creek's history. The town's residents were beginning to realize that something supernatural was affecting their community, but few understood the scope of the spiritual reckoning that was approaching. In a few hours, they would all be forced to confront the bloody foundations of their prosperity and choose between inherited guilt and collective redemption. The 3 pieces of Joseph's ritual staff pulsed with increasing energy, calling out to be reunited. But the reassembly would have to wait until the entire community was gathered to witness the completion of a ceremony that had been interrupted by violence and hatred over a century ago. The dead were rising to claim their justice, and the living would finally have to answer for the sins of their fathers. The reassembled ritual staff blazed with spiritual fire as Elena held it aloft in the center of Marrow Creek's town square. Its 3 pieces fused together by forces that existed beyond the physical world. The ancient cedar wood seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, while the carved symbols along its length glowed with the intensity of stars against the midnight sky. Every person in town had gathered around the makeshift ceremonial circle, their faces illuminated by torchlight and the otherworldly radiance emanating from Joseph Crow, Feather's most sacred artifact. The transformation had accelerated dramatically as the new moon reached its zenith. Nearly half the townspeople now showed signs of the supernatural infection, larvae moving beneath their skin, fever burning in their eyes, and a growing awareness of spiritual presences that had been invisible just hours before. The curse was no longer limited to the guilty bloodlines, but it spread to encompass everyone who lived on the stolen sacred ground. Caleb knelt beside the sacred artifacts that Elena had arranged in a precise pattern around the staff's base. His own transformation was so advanced that he seemed more spirit than flesh, his body serving as a conduit between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. When he spoke, it was with Joseph Crow Feather's voice, carrying the authority of a man who had died defending what he held most sacred. "People of Marrow Creek," the voice said through Caleb's lips, "you have lived for generations on ground watered with innocent blood. Your prosperity was built on murder, your peace purchased with genocide. Tonight, the spirits of the victims return to claim their justice." Sheriff Martinez stepped forward, the cursed badge heavy in his hands. The corrupted talisman seemed to fight against the staff's purifying influence, its surface crawling with shadows that resembled the larvae infecting the guilty descendants. "We acknowledge the crimes of our ancestors," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "My great-grandfather, Eduardo Martinez, was not a lawman but a murderer who corrupted his badge with innocent blood." The crowd murmured with shock and growing fear as the truth they had suspected but never acknowledged was finally spoken aloud. Some tried to back away from the ceremonial circle, but the spiritual forces at work held them. In place, witnesses were required for the ritual to be completed. Wade Thornton joined the sheriff in the circle's center, his hands visibly shaking, as the larvae beneath his skin formed patterns that resembled the brands he used on his cattle. "My great-grandfather led the conspiracy," he confessed. "He organized the massacre and claimed the sacred lands through violence and deception." Emma Peterson was the last of the 3 to approach, her voice barely above a whisper as she acknowledged her family's role. "My great-grandfather provided the weapons and supplies that made the murders possible. He profited from genocide and never faced justice for his crimes. Elena raised the ritual staff higher, its glow intensifying as the confessions were spoken. According to her grandmother's diary, this was the moment when the spiritual barrier between the living and the dead would become thinnest, when the victims of the long-ago massacre could finally make their presence known to those who had inherited the benefits of their deaths. "The spirits are coming," Caleb announced, his voice carrying both warning and wonder. They've been waiting over a century for this moment of acknowledgement. The air in the town square began to shimmer with heat distortion, though the desert. Night was cool. Shadows moved at the edges of the torchlight, not the shadows of the living townspeople, but shapes that belonged to another time and place. The ghostly figures of Joseph's community began to manifest, their forms translucent but unmistakably present. Doc. Harrison watched in amazement as his medical understanding of reality expanded to accommodate the supernatural phenomena before his eyes. The ghosts weren't terrifying apparitions, but ordinary people, families with children, elders with kind faces, young warriors who had died defending their community. They appeared as they had been in life, dressed in traditional clothing and bearing expressions of profound sadness rather than vengeful anger. At the center of the spiritual gathering stood Joseph Crowfeather himself, no longer speaking through Caleb but manifesting in his own form. The murdered healer appeared as a man in his prime, his long black hair adorned with feathers and his hands bearing the ritual scars of his calling. When he spoke, his words seemed to come from the very earth itself. "We have waited," Joseph said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of patient suffering. "We have watched as our sacred ground was defiled, our burial sites disturbed, our memory erased from the histories written by our killers. But we have not sought revenge, we have sought justice." Sheriff Martinez held up the cursed badge, its surface now writhing with visible corruption. "What justice do you require of us?" "Acknowledgement of the truth," Joseph replied. "Recognition of what was stolen, and commitment to ensure that such crimes are never repeated." The spiritual energy in the town square intensified as more ghost figures became visible. 17 victims of the original massacre, their forms growing more solid as the ritual approached its climax. They moved among the living townspeople, their presence causing the infected larvae to pulse with increasing brightness. "The land remembers," Joseph continued, gesturing toward the ground beneath their feet. "Every drop of blood spilled, every bone disturbed, every treaty broken, it all lives on in the spiritual fabric of this place. The curse we unleashed was not meant as punishment, but as protection, ensuring that the sacred ground would never again be vulnerable to desecration." Wade Thornton stepped closer to the ghostly healer, his cattle baron's pride struggling with the weight of inherited guilt. "What do you want us to do?" "We can't bring back the dead or undo the past. But you can choose the future," Joseph replied. "You can decide whether this land will continue to be haunted by unacknowledged crime or begin healing from the wounds of the past." Emma Peterson found her voice, addressing not just Joseph but all the assembled spirits. "Tell us how to make amends. Tell us what justice looks like after all these years." The ghostly figures began to move in a ceremonial pattern around the ritual staff, their forms becoming more substantial with each circuit. As they danced, their voices joined in a haunting chant that seemed to resonate from the earth itself, a song of mourning for the murdered and of hope for eventual reconciliation. Elena consulted her grandmother's diary, reading the passages that described the original protection ritual Joseph had been performing when he was killed. "The ceremony must be completed," she announced. "The spiritual guardians that were meant to protect this land must finally be established." "But who will serve as guardians?" Doc Harrison asked, recognizing that the transformation affecting the infected townspeople was reaching its final phase. Caleb rose from his kneeling position, his body now more spirit than flesh, glowing with the same otherworldly light as the ritual staff. Those who carry the guilt of the past and choose to bear the responsibility of the future, he said. The infected will complete their transformation, but instead of becoming instruments of vengeance, they will become protectors of the sacred ground. The implications were staggering. Half the town's population would be transformed into supernatural guardians, existing in the space between life and death to ensure that the sacred lands were never again violated. It was both salvation and sacrifice redemption purchased at the price of their human mortality. Sheriff Martinez was the first to understand and accept the terms. "If that's what justice requires," he said, dropping the cursed badge into the ritual fire that had spontaneously ignited around the staff's base. "Then I accept the transformation willingly." The badge burned with unnatural colors, its corruption finally being purged by the sacred flames. As it was consumed, the chaotic patterns beneath Martinez's skin began to organize themselves into coherent designs that resembled traditional law enforcement symbols, blessed by spiritual authority rather than corrupted by it. The ritual was approaching its climax, and soon the spirits of the 17 victims would render their final judgment on the living community that had inherited the benefits of their murders. The choice between justice and continued concealment would be made not just by the guilty families, but by every person who called the stolen sacred ground their home. Joseph Crow Feather's spirit bundle materialized in the sacred flames, its ethereal form woven from moonlight and memory, containing the essence of a soul that had wandered between worlds for over a century. As the ghostly artifact took shape, above the ritual fire, the murdered healer's consciousness finally began to separate from Caleb's failing body, preparing to find the peace that had been denied to him by violence and betrayal. The bundle pulsed with gentle light, each strand of spiritual energy representing a connection to the ancestors who had guided Joseph's life and the descendants who would carry his legacy forward. Within its translucent depths, the townspeople could see flashes of what the sacred land had been before the massacre, a place of ceremony and healing, where the boundary between the living and the dead was honored rather than violated. "The choice is before you," Joseph's spirit said, his voice carrying both sorrow for the past and hope for the future. "You can complete the transformation and become guardians of this sacred ground, or you can reject the responsibility and face the consequences of continued denial." Elena held the ritual staff steady as the spiritual energy reached its peak intensity. Around the ceremonial circle, the infected townspeople began to glow with the same otherworldly light that emanated from Joseph's bundle, their human forms becoming increasingly translucent as the moment of final transformation approached. Wade Thornton stepped forward, his cattle empire and material wealth suddenly seeming insignificant compared to the weight of spiritual justice. "I accept," he said, his voice carrying across the silent square. "My family built their fortune on murder and land theft. If becoming a guardian is the price of redemption, then I pay it willingly." As he spoke the words of acceptance, the larvae beneath his skin transformed into something beautiful, intricate patterns that resembled traditional beadwork, glowing with soft light that spoke of protection rather than infection. His physical form remained human, but something fundamental had changed in his spiritual essence. Emma Peterson watched Wade's transformation with a mixture of fear and recognition. The supernatural process wasn't destroying their humanity, but elevating it, creating beings who existed simultaneously in the material and spiritual worlds. "I accept as well," she said, feeling the larvae in her own body respond to her conscious choice. "My family profited from genocide. Let me spend eternity ensuring it never happens again." One by one, the infected townspeople made their choices. Some embraced the transformation willingly, understanding that becoming a guardian was both punishment and privilege. Others resisted, trying to flee the ceremonial circle, only to discover that the spiritual forces at work would not be denied. Harrison, though uninfected himself, stepped forward to address Joseph's spirit directly. What about those of us who aren't marked by the curse? What role do we play in this new reality? You bear witness, Joseph replied, his form beginning to fade as the spirit bundle absorbed his essence. You remember what happened here and ensure that future generations understand the true cost of the prosperity they inherit. Caleb knelt beside the ritual fire, his body now more spirit than flesh as Joseph's consciousness prepared to depart. The young cowboy had served as the bridge between the living and the dead, but that role was coming to an end. Thank you, he whispered, speaking to the healer's departing spirit. Thank you for choosing me to carry your truth. The truth was always here, Joseph replied, his voice growing fainter as his spirit bundle began to ascend toward the star-filled sky. You simply had the courage to acknowledge it. The ghostly figures of the 17 massacre victims began to fade as well, their long vigil finally coming to an end. But before they departed, each spirit touched one of the transformed townspeople, bestowing a blessing that would guide their guardianship through the centuries to come. Sheriff Martinez felt his ancestors' corruption finally leave him as a young warrior's spirit placed a translucent hand on his shoulder. The cursed badge had been destroyed in the sacred flames, replaced by spiritual authority that came not from human institutions, but from the land itself. We forgive, the warrior said, his words barely audible, but we do not forget. Guard well what we died protecting. As the last of the victim spirits departed for the peaceful realm beyond, Joseph Crowfeather's bundle completed its ascension, carrying the healer's consciousness to the eternal rest that had been denied to him for so long. The ritual was complete. The curse transformed from an instrument of vengeance into a force of protection. The new guardians stood in the town square, their human forms intact, but their spiritual essence forever changed. They could feel the sacred land's pain and joy, sense any threat to the burial grounds that lay beneath the settlement, and communicate with the spiritual forces that maintained the balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. Elena lowered the ritual staff, its purpose fulfilled. The ancient artifact would remain in the transformed community as a symbol of justice acknowledged and responsibility accepted. It's over, she said, though they all understood that in many ways it was just beginning. The townspeople who had not been transformed looked around in wonder and fear, recognizing that their community had been forever changed by the night's events. Marrow Creek would never again be an ordinary frontier settlement. It was now a place where the supernatural and mundane existed in careful balance, protected by guardians who had paid the ultimate price for their ancestors' crimes. Dawn was approaching, painting the eastern sky with shades of pink and gold. The new moon had passed, and with it, the deadline that had threatened to consume them all in uncontrolled transformation. Instead, they had achieved something unprecedented, a reconciliation between the living and the dead that honored both justice and mercy. Joseph Crowfeather's spirit bundle had completed its journey, carrying the healer's consciousness to the eternal rest he deserved. But his protection remained, embodied in the transformed guardians who would ensure that the sacred ground beneath Marrow Creek was never again violated by greed or hatred. The curse was broken, but the responsibility it represented would endure forever. 6 months after the night that transformed Marrow Creek forever, the new memorial stone stood at the heart of what had once been an ordinary frontier town. Carved from the same red sandstone as the original sacred marker in Blackwater Canyon, the monument bore the names of Joseph Crowfeather and the 17 victims of the 1887 massacre, their memory finally honored after more than a century of deliberate erasure. The stone was more than just a memorial. It was a promise etched in granite that such atrocities would never again be forgotten or repeated. Surrounding it, the town square had been transformed into a place of reflection and education. where visitors could learn the true history of the region and understand the price that had been paid for its settlement. Caleb stood before the memorial. In the early morning light, his transformation into a guardian having left him changed, but still recognizably human. The larvae that had once writhed beneath his skin had become intricate patterns of living light, visible only to those who possessed spiritual sight. He served as the bridge between the transformed guardians and the ordinary townspeople, helping both communities adapt to their new reality. "The foundation is almost ready," he said to Alina, who approached carrying a leather portfolio filled with documents and plans. "Wade's lawyers have finished the paperwork, transferring the disputed lands to the tribal council. It should be official by the end of the week." Elena smiled, her dark eyes reflecting the satisfaction of justice finally served. She had taken on the role of coordinator between the various parties involved in the restitution efforts, working to ensure that the acknowledgement of historical crimes translated into concrete action rather than empty gestures. "The Peterson family has agreed to fund the cultural center," she reported. "Emma says it's the least they can do to help preserve the knowledge that was almost lost when her great-grandfather helped massacre the keepers of that wisdom." The cultural center would be built on the site where Joseph Crow Feather's medicine lodge had once stood, serving as both museum and active ceremonial space where traditional practices could be revived and maintained. It was one of many projects initiated by the guilty families as they worked to make meaningful amends for their ancestors' crimes. Sheriff Martinez emerged from the courthouse across the square, no longer wearing the badge that had symbolized his family's corruption, but still serving the community in his role as guardian. His transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all the spiritual authority he now carried was both more powerful and more carefully constrained than any human law enforcement position. "The Historical Commission has approved the new textbooks," he announced, holding up a thick volume that told the complete story of the region's settlement, including the previously hidden genocide. "Every school in the territory will be required to teach the true history, not the sanitized version that's been passed down for generations." Wade Thornton approached from the direction of what had once been his sprawling ranch house, now converted into a community meeting hall and resource center. His transformation into a guardian had required giving up the material wealth built on his ancestors' crimes, but he seemed more at peace than he had ever been as a cattle baron. "The families have started arriving for the ceremony," he said, referring to the descendants of other indigenous communities who had survived similar massacres throughout the territory. "Representatives from 7 different tribes will be here to witness the dedication." Doc Harrison emerged from his clinic, his medical bag replaced by a thick journal, where he continued documenting the ongoing effects of the supernatural transformation. His role had evolved from treating physical ailments to serving as the community's chronicler and scientific observer of phenomena that existed beyond conventional understanding. "The children born since the transformation are showing remarkable abilities," he reported. "Enhanced empathy, spiritual sensitivity, and what can only be described as an innate understanding of justice. It's as if the protective blessing is being passed down to the next generation." The memorial stone seemed to pulse with gentle warmth. As the morning sun climbed higher, its carved surface reflecting light in patterns that resembled the traditional artwork of Joseph's people. Visitors often reported feeling a sense of peace and resolution when they approached the monument, as if the spirits of the victims were finally at rest. Emma Peterson arrived with a group of schoolchildren, part of the educational program she had established to ensure that young people understood the full implications of their community's history. The children listened with solemn attention as she explained how their town had been built on hidden violence and how acknowledging that truth had led to healing rather than shame. "Why did it take so long for people to tell the truth?" one child asked, her innocent question cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Because truth can be painful," Emma replied gently. And sometimes people choose to hide from pain rather than face it and find healing on the other side. Martha Prescott approached the group with her arms full of historical documents that had been discovered in recent months. Papers that previous generations had hidden or destroyed in their attempts to conceal the massacre. The truth, once unleashed, seemed determined to reveal itself completely. "We found more evidence in the territorial archives," she announced. Letters between the three families discussing their plans. Maps showing the locations of other sacred sites they intended to violate. And financial records proving they profited directly from the stolen land. The discoveries continued to emerge as the community committed itself to complete transparency about its past. Each new revelation, rather than deepening shame, seemed to strengthen the town's resolve to ensure that such crimes could never again be covered up or forgotten. As the dedication ceremony began, representatives from across the territory gathered around the memorial stone. Tribal elders offered prayers in languages that had nearly been silenced forever. All government officials acknowledged the complicity of federal and territorial authorities in the systematic genocide that had swept the region. The transformed guardians stood at the edges of the crowd, their spiritual senses alert for any threat to the sacred ground they had sworn to protect. But today brought no danger, only recognition, remembrance, and the promise that justice delayed would never again become justice denied. Caleb placed his hand on the memorial stone and felt the presence of Joseph Crowfeather's spirit, no longer trapped between worlds, but visiting from the peaceful realm where he now rested. The healer's consciousness touched Caleb's briefly, conveying gratitude and approval for what the community had accomplished. "He's proud of us," Caleb said softly. To Elena, "Joseph is proud that his death led not to eternal hatred, but to eventual healing." Elena squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of spiritual energy flowing between them. The town of Marrow Creek had been transformed in ways that went far beyond the supernatural changes affecting its guardian population. It had become a place where truth was valued above comfort and justice was pursued, even when it came at great cost. The memorial stone stood as a testament to what was possible when communities found the courage to face their darkest histories and commit themselves to creating a better future. The names carved in its surface would never be forgotten again, and the sacred ground beneath the town would be protected by guardians who had chosen responsibility over denial. As the sun reached its zenith, casting no shadows on the memorial stone, the assembled crowd observed a moment of silence for all those who had died in the systematic genocide that once swept the territory. But it was not a silence of despair, it was a silence of respect, remembrance, and renewed commitment to ensuring that such atrocities belong permanently to the past. The curse of Joseph Crowfeather had been transformed into a blessing that would protect the sacred lands and their guardians for generations to come. Truth had been acknowledged, justice had been served, and healing had begun for both the living and the dead. The memorial stone stood as proof that some wounds, no matter how old or deeply buried, could still be healed through courage, commitment, and the transformative power of acknowledged truth.